to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. Hello and welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. We are up to episode number 30. Thanks for joining us. Now today on the podcast we're going to be talking about lesson planning. It's one of the bread and butter things that all language teachers need to do. I have seen in my time as a language teacher and a trainer of language teachers, I've seen different types of lesson preparation. So let me describe for you just a minute 4 different categories, and I'd like you to take a minute to think about what kind of lesson planner are you? Which of these descriptions suit you best? A. You have all of your lessons pre-planned a year in advance. B. You plan once a week for the whole week. C. You just look at the teacher's guide the night before to figure out what you'll be teaching the next day. D. You walk into the classroom and just wing your way through your time with the students. Notice I didn't even call that a lesson. Now, obviously, there's not necessarily a right answer here, and I have actually seen examples of all of the above. In terms of option A, where the whole year is planned, I did know a teacher who had everything filed, perfectly tidy for the whole semester. I remember seeing him take out the appropriate folder with a printed lesson plan, and it even had handwritten comments from the last time he taught that lesson the previous semester. He just read through it, spent 10 minutes getting his photocopying ready, and then he was ready for the class. The digital material he needed to present the lesson was all ready for him on his hard drive, and it was truly eye-opening for me as a young teacher to see someone so prepared and so confident to walk into his classroom like that. Now, my natural tendency is to be slightly disorganized, so to see someone at this end of the spectrum was actually quite a shock at that time, and it was really something I decided I wanted to aspire to, because being the naturally disorganized person that I am, my confidence level were not as high as his was. However, most teachers I know are not quite that extreme with their planning and organization, and most are a mix of options B and C. So many people use a weekly or a monthly planner to kind of roughly plan out how fast through the curriculum they'll be moving. And then at some point prior to each lesson, maybe once a week or maybe the night before or day before, they'll read through any teacher's guides that go with the curriculum they're using and draw up a plan for the actual day or the lesson, and prepare whatever materials that they'll be needing, whether it's physical resources or digital technology tools and so on. That's kind of the standard. And as for that last option, sort of just winging it, well, believe it or not, that was me at one stage in my career. In fact, if you believe it or not, it's true, I did that during my CELTA course. Of all times, when the very people who would eventually decide whether or not I would qualify and gain that important international certification in teaching adults, yes, they were watching, and yes, I went in front of a class without a lesson plan. I have never done it again. It wasn't all terrible, if I'm honest. We managed to get through what was needed, and so I think I must have known at least roughly what was going to happen in class. But it was noted by my instructors for sure that I had no plan, and I even got a funny certificate from my co-trainees at the end of the CELTA course, acknowledging that I had done what probably nobody else would dare to do. It was a dumb decision not to have a lesson plan, and, to be honest, probably that bad choice was made due to lack of sleep, and being overwhelmed with studying in CELTA, which is also quite common amongst trainees. But I have since then, which is a couple of decades plus, a year ago, I have learned to be much more organized. And let me just tell you, life is a little bit better when you are organized. So if you find that you yourself are also a little bit more on the disorganized end of the spectrum, take heart. organization skills are definitely something that you can learn. And I am proud to say that yes, after a few years teaching, I too had lesson plans for a whole semester mapped out, filed nicely, both paper versions and electronic versions of those plans, which made my day-to-day teaching much, much easier. But if you're just starting out and you're trying to figure out, a good way to plan a lesson, or you just want to know what the components are that go into a good lesson plan, then today's podcast is for you. There is quite a lot of work to do to plan a lesson, but as you get more experienced, it definitely becomes much easier. And it actually doesn't take much time because a lot of the thinking becomes automatic with time and with practice. It's kind of like learning any skill. There are 4 main stages of learning a skill. The first stage is the unconscious incompetence stage, which basically is just a fancy way of saying can't do it, and you don't even know that you can't do it. Like you're not even conscious that you want to do it, so you just no awareness whatsoever. The next stage, you move into the conscious incompetence stage, which means you know you're not good at it. And even though you can't do it, it's a key change in progress because you can never improve something that you're not aware of. So becoming aware that there is a skill you'd like to learn and learning to observe that skill in other people is a very, very important stage in the learning process. The third stage in the learning process is called the conscious competence stage, which means you can do it, you're competent, if you think really carefully about it and work hard at it, all of your conscious efforts required to enable you to achieve the task. So yes, you can do it, but it's hard work. And then the final stage, the fourth and final stage, is unconscious competence. And that is where you do the task, and sometimes very well, without even thinking about it. And if you imagine musicians or something playing without any music, they're just playing how they feel the music coming through their body, you can be sure they've spent years and years practicing that skill, but they're at a stage where it just sort of flows out almost unconsciously and they're just playing. Sometimes I talk to my students about these stages of learning because whatever stage you're at in learning a language is always difficult, because you're pushing yourself along in being able to speak the language and you're always learning something. But I tell them, remember what it was like when you were just learning your first words, and even that was hard. Well, now you know heaps of words really quickly, so they're already at that unconscious competent stage for the earlier stages of language acquisition. And I try to encourage them. I usually taught adults, so I say, think about when you learn to drive a car. When you first start learning how to drive a car, you realize how much you don't know, and it can be overwhelming. And then you start to learn and you can do it, but it can sometimes be a little bit tricky and stressful. You've got to think what your feet need to do with the pedals, which one was it to do which thing, and you've got 2 different levers, one on the right, one on the left, and one does the indication and one does the windscreen wipers, and you sometimes get them mixed up, and then you've got to be watching the road and all the traffic around you and reading the road signs and steering the car, and sometimes it's just very stressful. And certainly teaching people to drive, you feel that stress, and it's just really not a thing you want to be doing a lot. But after a lot of practice with driving a car, one day you're just driving along and you realize you're changing gear, you're indicating, you're turning the steering wheel, and you're chatting to your passengers all at the same time. It's completely automatic and there's no stress involved because you've finally reached that unconscious competence stage. So even though what I'm about to tell you about lesson planning might seem like there's a lot of steps involved and it's kind of complicated, it sort of is when you think about it. But as I say, with time and with experience, with a lot of lesson planning and teaching a lot of lessons over the years, it'll just become automatic. You'll be thinking about these things automatically and you won't necessarily have to spend a huge amount of time doing it. But you do need to learn it. So with that said, here in a nutshell is a summary of what you need to think about when you're planning a language lesson. It doesn't matter what kind of lesson it is. You might be teaching new vocabulary, you might be teaching new grammar structures, you might be working with a text for reading. You might be working with a spoken text or a video to improve skills in listening. You might be practicing speaking skills, writing skills, whatever. The structure of the lesson plan is the same. It follows the same process, just the content is different. So here it is. I have got 6 different stages, so here they are. First, write down what you want students to achieve during the lesson. That may sound very simplistic, but it should be the center and forefront of everything you do when you're planning that lesson. This is sometimes called the learning outcome. So you could write it in a sentence like, by the end of the lesson today, learners will be able to... and that's what they're achieving. It's their ability to do something that they couldn't do before your lesson, right? You need to be absolutely crystal clear about what it is your students will be able to do. That should be at the top of the page, and everything below it should fit within that goal. That's why you're doing what you're doing. If it's not crystal clear to you what exactly the outcome is, the language that you're teaching, whether it's words or grammar or the skills, then you can be sure the learners won't know what they're learning either. So you as the teacher need to make that clear to them as well. Not necessarily the beginning of the lesson. There's different ways to do that, but you need to be really clear yourself as the teacher. Here is an example of a bad learning outcome. Quote, to work through page 32 of the textbook, unquote. That is about material, not about learning. It's got nothing to do with the target language. Now, if you are working in an environment where the Director of Studies has actually told you to work through page 32 today, then your job as you're planning your lesson is to study the material that's on page 32 and figure out what the language is or what the skills are that the material is focusing on, and then plan your lesson around the skills, not around the piece of paper. All right, so there's a difference between the lesson materials and the lesson's learning outcomes. All right, so once that's clear at the top of the page, step 2, estimate or think about or figure out how much the learners already know about the topic and what their skill levels already are in that area. Now, the best teaching is, of course, bringing learners one step further in their language learning journey. But if you have no idea where they're at in that journey, this is not possible. So how will you know? How are you going to figure out how to guide them to take the next step if you don't know where they are now? If you're brand new to the class, or maybe you're a relief teacher, or it's a new cohort of students or something like that, you have no idea what the students know, then your first job is to figure that out. Do some diagnostic activities and see what they can do. Most language schools do have a diagnostic placement test. So a student would apply to go to the language school, they do a little test, and then they're put into an appropriate class at an appropriate level. So that definitely helps. But yeah, you should roughly, and if you've been teaching that same class for a while, you'll kind of already know where they're at, but you need to be conscious of that as you're planning your activities, which is the next step. But I would say here also, do plan for a few lower level students, because there's always a few in the class who are not kind of at the average stage where other people are. So how are you going to assist them to come up to speed in your lesson? Are you going to have a few extra vocabulary items written on the board that will help them? Will you have a summary of some of the key structures for them to refer to? If it's a skill-based lesson, will you have an easier version of the text for them to read or listening to? That kind of thing. Just have a little bit of extra things up your sleeve for the lower level students. Step number 3 is prepare some tasks for the students to learn from, which will allow them to grow their skills. Notice I did say tasks. I am definitely a fan of task-based teaching. In other words, a lesson should be full of different activities that students are doing. It's not about students sitting passively in a room listening to somebody talk. You should always be asking yourself as you're planning your lesson, what will the students actually do to learn the target structures or skills? Now, just because it's a task-based lesson doesn't mean you're only going to be playing games. And, I'm the first to admit I love games, and I've advocated for using games many times. I'm also a fan of old-fashioned drilling. In other words, getting students to repeat something many times. Drilling is a form of a task. It's an activity that students do. Now, you certainly can't fill a whole lesson with drilling, that would be very boring, but it does have its place in a task-based lesson, particularly when students are learning about pronunciation and developing the automaticity of the muscle movements that contribute to fluency in speaking. The point is, it's about students learning, not about teachers telling them things. Most of us learn best when we have figured something out for ourselves. So wherever possible, you're going to be encouraging students to discover the target language or encourage them to be practicing the skills until they've figured it out for themselves or embedded that skill. Now, if you're not sure about what kinds of tasks you can do in a classroom, I would encourage you for sure to look at some example lesson plans from some teacher books of well-known publishers or something like that. Most of them have some great activities that you can learn about. But that is the core of the lesson, these activities that you will be designing for your students to do. All right, step number 4. You need to think about your tasks and make sure that the order of tasks, the difficulty of the tasks, and the timing of the tasks, in other words, how long they take, is appropriate. The tasks should carry on from one another in terms of their difficulty. So you want to start out doing some easy tasks to remind students of what they already know, and then increase the difficulty so that students are guided along to more complex learning and practice tasks. And the type of activities need to vary throughout your lesson. No one likes to do the same thing for a long period of time, so you might want to put some quiet activities in there, some noisy activities, some pair work, some group work, some individual work. Now, obviously, you don't have to have all of those things in one lesson, but it's good to think about how your students are going to experience that lesson. Are they going to get bored? Are they going to be exhausted? None of those extremes are going to be fun. So, or pleasant, I guess. Not all lessons have to be fun, but they need to be enjoyable enough that they're going to come back, right? And obviously your lesson has a time allocation, anywhere from say half an hour up to maybe a 2-hour lecture time slot, whatever you've got. Your prepared activities need to fit in within that time slot. So, think about how long each activity is going to take. And that, anticipating time is one thing that comes with a lot of experience. I used to wildly anticipate timing wrong, and students would be finished in 2 minutes and I had planned 10 minutes or something like that. But you get used to how long things take as you get more experienced. All right, step number 5 is anticipate what might go wrong in your lesson. Yes, things often go wrong, or at least not according to your plan. It may not be terrible. So the best thing to do as you're planning your lesson is simply plan for what might go wrong and figure out how you're going to deal with it. So here's some example things you need to think about. What are you going to do if students don't know some of the really key vocabulary? What if students are feeling very shy and don't want to speak to others? What if students have forgotten to bring their workbooks? What if one game takes a long time to finish? What if students find the reading too difficult? What if the technology you're planning to use doesn't work on the day? What if students ask you difficult questions about the grammar that you can't answer? What if no one knows the current event that you're planning to talk about? You can think about all of these different issues and come up with sort of a plan B for how you will deal with it if anything like that happens. And this just increases your confidence so that you can go into the lesson knowing that you could handle it if something like that happened. And the final step, number 6, is get practical. So list, after you know what you're going to do, list all the materials that you're going to need, any technology you're going to be using, what books you need to be bringing with you. If you're going to be using the whiteboard, you might like to plan a whiteboard sketch. Some people are great at judging the space that they're going to need on a whiteboard. Others are hopeless at it. So if you need a little bit of assistance, or if you tend to write big or run out of room a lot, just plan. Whereabouts on the whiteboard are you going to write the words, and how much space are you going to need, and so on. And ensure that all the technology is booked if you need to book it, or that you've tried it out at least the day before or something like that. So just all the little practical things you need to remember. So those are the 6 steps. To help you remember, you can kind of think of it like a planning sandwich. The first thing you need to do is get really clear on the learning that needs to happen, what the goal is and what the starting point of your students is. The second thing, the meat in the sandwich, if you like, is designing your tasks and refining them in terms of length, variation, and so on. And then third, at the end, closing off the sandwich, is anticipate any problems and then preparing your materials. So the meat, really, the biggest part is just designing those tasks. So that's it. If you would like to download a summary of this lesson planning process, we've got a download for you. You can just click on the link in the show notes or on the podcast page. The podcast page, you can navigate to it at www.languagefuel.com/podcast. When you click on the link, just type in your email address and then we'll send you the document with these planning stages. Now, in the document, there's actually 2 parts. There's a half-page summary of these stages with a few notes under each one. And then there's also on the same page a small wallet card sized reminder, like a credit card sized reminder of just the 6 stages. So you can print that out and you can put it in your wallet if you like, or stick it on your computer monitor with a little bit of blue tack in the corner, so it's always there to remind you what to do. And if you've done any of the Language Fuel Academy courses before, you may have picked up that I am actually a really big fan of these wallet-sized reminder cards. I think low-tech memory aids like that are really, really effective. So that's it. Thank you for listening. Have fun with all of your lesson planning. It definitely does get easier, but the first wee while you do need to really consciously think about all of these things, and if you've got a well-planned lesson, it's bound to go really well for you, and you'll just enjoy yourself because you're prepared and you know that you'll be able to handle whatever comes your way during the lesson. Have fun. Thanks again for listening. See you next time. Ka kite anō. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. See you next time.